Hello, and welcome to part 4 of Sheldon's at Gettysburg. And as you can see, who you're used to seeing on these introductions of the video is not here yet because we decided to do things a bit different in this part. I'm going to turn this over and become the interviewer, and who I'm going to interview is our own Kelly Wheaton. Believe it or not, Kelly Wheaton has something that she's going to tell you that may just surprise you. Kelly, welcome to part 4.
Thank you, George.
Kelly, before we get started really down this path, could you tell us a little bit about how you're connected to the Sheldon family?
Absolutely. My grandmother was a Sheldon, and she goes back all the way to through Michigan, Dutchess County, not she, but her line, and ends up being part of the John of Kingstown Sheldons, who we, through DNA and through a document that I found last year, we believe that the John of Kingstown is the son of Isaac Sr. of Windsor, Connecticut.
Kelly, you just mentioned Dutchess County. Would you mind telling everybody where that's located?
Yes, it's on the Hudson River, on the east side of the Hudson River. I'd say maybe a halfway up the Hudson River as you're going up out of New York City.
Kelly is certainly known by those of us that hang around at the Sheldon Genealogy website because of her expertise as a DNA person. Could you tell us how you got so involved and became so knowledgeable with DNA, and in particular, Sheldon DNA?
Yeah, that's kind of an interesting story. I had spent 40 years trying to connect my husband, who's a Wheaton, to one of two Wheatons. There are two immigrants in early colonial New England, and one was a Thomas Wheaton, whose descendants changed the name to Wheaton, and he settled in Connecticut. And there was a Robert Wheaton who settled in Rehoboth, Massachusetts. And I could not, after 40 years, figure out which one my husband belonged to. I couldn't make the connection on paper. So in utter frustration, I gave him a DNA kit, a Y DNA kit for Valentine's Day. And within about 5 weeks, I had proved that he was a descendant of Robert Wheaton and not of Thomas Wheaton. So that was my first foray into DNA, and it wasn't even my own. But then shortly thereafter, I tested myself and him with autosomal DNA and got very involved at 23andMe, tested like 8 family members there, and started hanging out on their forums. And in the beginning, the genetic genealogy world was just a bunch of people helping each other a lot. So that's where I cut my teeth, and where I started to learn. And if I couldn't understand something, I would ask somebody how to do it. And finally, I said, we keep answering the same questions over and over again. Why don't we write a book or, do something? And I had a couple other people that were interested, and they just kind of fell by the wayside. So I built a website with that includes the Beginner's Guide to Genetic Genealogy, which was the product of me trying to make things really, really, really basic and simple for people starting out with DNA. So that's how I got started there. And my connection with the Sheldon DNA project was I was looking at the DNA results for the Y-DNA, and they were all scrambled. There was no breaking it into groups, and you couldn't figure out who was related to whom. And I was trying to locate someone who was representative of my Sheldon line. And so I contacted the administrators and offered to help. And we did a Zoom session, and I showed them, and they invited me to be an administrator. And then not too long after that, they were having, the Sheldon Family Association was having a annual meeting in Sacramento, and I was asked to be a speaker there. So that's really how I got started on it. And to this day, I manage all the Sheldon DNA coming in. We have, I think, a dozen results from kits that have been sponsored in England, so that we were able to, for instance, connect you, George, with your mates in England who are also descended from the Sheldons of Derbyshire.
Kelly, has there ever been anybody that had no idea where their connection was and they got a hold of you and you recommended to do some DNA tests, and because of what you're able to do with that magical spreadsheet of yours and that knowledge that you have, that you're able to connect them to the tree where they belong?
Absolutely. It happens more often than you would think. I mean, that happened for you, I believe, turning the
That's
table.
really what I'm asking you about. Tell everybody my story, what you were able to figure out.
Well, you didn't know which of the Sheldon progenitors or lines that you were likely to descend from. And through the autosomal DNA, we were able to put you in either into the Derbyshire group. But then when you did a big Y, we got further down so that we could connect you to the Godfrey line, is where we're thinking that you come down from. But in the absence of paper records, of typical genealogical records, DNA can be just a wonderful asset to help break down brick walls that otherwise, like the example I gave with my husband, where you just can't get there from here, but the DNA can.
Well, Kelly, in my particular case, with you and your magical DNA analysis, you were able to connect me to 11 generations. Does that surprise you that you were able to do that, that you were able to connect me back? In other words, I'm going back to my 9th great grandfather, Godfrey, through your DNA.
It doesn't surprise me now, but in the beginning, it did surprise me that the way that you can track back through time. And it's really in the fairly recently with the big Y and other Y SNP testing that we've been able to, we can literally go back from you to proverbial Adam. So we can track you through history based on mutations, because you start with what we call proverbial Adam, sort of the original male humans, and they would all have identical Y DNA until there was a mutation in the process of the germ cell that became the sperm cell that fertilized the egg that became you. That Y DNA gets passed down intact, and only occasionally there will be a mutation. Those mutations identify branching just like you would on a tree. And so you can literally say, okay, we have 3 men, they all descend from this ancestor, but as we come down from that ancestor, there's a mutation here. And the brothers, these 2 brothers didn't have that mutation. So now if you test that Y DNA and you're positive for that mutation, we know that you came from that man. You descended from that brother and not from his brother, Peter or George. So,
Well, Kelly, as we continue down this path, and what else I have to ask you, would you sort of just tell us how you came up with this idea that you wanted me to, of all people, to talk about Gettysburg?
well, for one, I read your book, and we are friends, and we got to know each other through Y DNA and through our weekly Sheldon genealogy chats, which you can find on Sheldon Genealogy on our webpage. And I've kind of fallen into just doing interviews of various Sheldons and seeing where it would lead. And I mean, there's hundreds and hundreds of Sheldons across the country and around the world, and lots of them are very interesting, as you well know, because you was posting interesting things about Sheldons on our Facebook group.
Well, somewhere along the line, I know that I mentioned to you that I found there's a Lieutenant George W. Sheldon over in Gettysburg, and that seemed to at least pick your interest a little bit. And you were kind enough to do a little bit of research, as I recall. Could you tell us what your research led you to find?
Yeah, I mean, sometimes when you do genealogy research, it's really wonderful and easy, and things just, fall into your lap, and it's all great, and you can go straight back. I wanted to figure out Lieutenant George's connection, which Sheldon line he was from. Was he a descendant of Isaac, or was he a descendant of John, or was he a descendant of Godfrey? I just thought, I was curious, so I wanted to try to do that. So I started looking for information about him on the census records. I located him on 2 census records. So I had his father's name, which is William, and William and George, John, Thomas. These are not very helpful names when you're doing genealogy research and you have hundreds of Johns and Georges and Williams and whatnot. So I was kind of stuck for a while, and then I went and looked at newspapers to try to find an article about the death of Lieutenant George Sheldon, and I wasn't too happy that I wasn't able to find something. I thought that there should have been some acknowledgement of his death, and I was not able to locate anything. Now, there's some newspapers that haven't been digitized, so it's possible that there was something in his hometown paper and that I didn't have it available to me. But I was still stuck with William and trying to go backwards in time with him. And I did find an obituary for his second wife. This wouldn't have been Lieutenant George's mother, but his father's second wife. And that led me to a marriage certificate, which told me where William was born. And that was the key that I needed to figure out what line he belonged to. And it turns out that he is from the Dutchess County Sheldons, of which I come from. So we are cousins. And I'll post a chart so that you can see how we're related. I haven't completely tidied it up because there were 2 brothers that came from Dutchess into, I'm going to pronounce this wrong, Rensselaer County in New York. And then there's 2 generations in there before you get to the William, who is the father of Lieutenant George. So I'm not sure, because each of those brothers had like 6 sons, and then they had sons and sons. I'm not sure of the exact connection, but we're related. So I have a Sheldon cousin who was at Gettysburg, which I never expected to find that.
Well, Kelly, I'm forever connected at Gettysburg because I wrote that book. I never expected it when I first conceived the idea and I proposed the idea to a publisher and the publisher accepted it. I never thought that I'd be so closely tied now to Gettysburg. I certainly didn't know about my great-grandfather being a soldier over there and being wounded. Now you happen to be connected forever to Gettysburg. I think if I recall correctly, you actually said you visited Gettysburg.
Okay, so you asked me about visiting Gettysburg?
Did you, I just asked you, did you actually visit Gettysburg at some time?
Yes, I did go to Gettysburg on a very, very hot and humid day with my children when they were probably 3 and 5. And at the time they had the big diorama
I have
there.
to ask you, how do you feel now about Gettysburg, knowing your connection there?
I feel like I do about so many things having to do with history. When you can connect it to someone you know, something personal, it makes it more interesting, more meaningful. You feel connected to it. And I had another one of these surprise Sheldon connections with a different war that just happened recently, which we had talked about in our Sheldon Zoom call. And that was, I was researching a Revolutionary War ancestor, Peter Hall, and I found out that he served under Colonel Elijah Sheldon, and that he was part of the dragoons, I can't remember if it was the 2nd or the 4th Horse, and these were troops that were associated and protected Washington and were spies. And so again, whenever history becomes alive because you can realize that you had people that were involved in that history, it's a different animal. And I wish that when we were in school that they would have made more of an attempt to connect us personally with history.
Because it's been so long since you've been there, and you certainly didn't know about Lieutenant George W. Sheldon at the time, do you realize how close where he's laid to rest is where Lincoln delivered his famous speech?
I did not know that at the time. I do now from you visiting it, and if I have the opportunity, I think that going again and knowing the places with the detail that you gave in your book, the personal stories and my own personal connection, your personal connection, I think that would make for a much more meaningful visit, because I know so much more. And I think that's for me the whole business of genealogy, whether it be traditional or DNA, is to place ourselves in history, to place ourselves in time, to care more about where we come from, our past, our history, and how we're all connected. I mean, if you go back to my proverbial Adam, whether or not that was an individual, as in the biblical story, whatever your belief system is, but those original human beings are the ancestors of all of us. And so that connectedness, and to connect to other people through stories and through genealogy, I don't know, that's what keeps me going, doing it. I really love it.
Well, Kelly, just an important part of who we are, where we came from, and probably where we're going. It's just,
Yeah.
and I have to tell you, I'm so grateful that you were able to help me get my connection. It's still quite moving to me. I will always.
I'm happy. I'm happy to have done so,
Just
and I
suggest
just
that because there's so many Sheldons that came through the state of New York, and so many New York troops were at Gettysburg, I would really encourage anybody that has Sheldon roots, and if they have Sheldons that connect to New York, and if they're interested at all in seeing how they connect to history, they may really find out that suddenly they have connections to Sheldons that were at Gettysburg.
do we remember how many that we know of that were the Sheldons at Gettysburg? I can't remember what the number was.
There's we don't know the exact number, but just doing a little bit of research from finding this, I have found, as far as Civil War soldiers from New York, I have found over 200 Sheldons, and that's Sheldon spelled with both Sheldon and Den. And because they came from New York, like I said, New York was one of the major suppliers of troops. It's just where the Army happened to be. In the New York Army, the men that made up from, or that came from New York, part of the fact they were the troops that were sent to Gettysburg. The Pennsylvania troops, if you will, many of them were further south and in other campaigns during the.
Well, I think it's, I mean, I hope that anybody that has watched this series of videos, if they do have people in New York or any of the surrounding areas that were Sheldons, that they do take this as a opportunity, as a encouragement to dig a little deeper.
Well, Kelly, thank you for allowing me to interview you. This has been quite an honor. I never expected that when you first asked me whether I would do a little video for you about the Gettysburg book that I wrote. So thank you for allowing me to interview you. Thank you for revealing your Sheldon connection to Gettysburg. And I'm going to turn the video now back over to you.
Well, thank you, George. It's been delightful. I've really enjoyed reading your book. I encourage other people, read George's book if you want to learn more about the backstory, I think, of Gettysburg, the more personal end of Gettysburg. And this is the end of our 4-part series. I hope you will join us again for another interview. I don't know who I'll be interviewing next, but we'll wait and find out. Thank you all.